We know that exercise and diet are the two primary variables which influence our body composition. However, each plays a different role in these processes and might be manipulated differently based on our current goals. So what does manipulating our diet achieve? What adaptations does resistance training provide? And what role does cardio play? First, let's break down the role of exercise in the muscle growth and fat loss process. We are going to break down exercise into 3 different categories: resistance training, general physical activity, and cardio. First, let's cover the role of resistance training. There are 3 primary adaptations that resistance training provides. The first and most relevant for body composition changes is muscle growth. Resistance training is pretty much universally accepted as the most effective way to build muscle mass. Resistance training of any form is usually going to be effective at building muscle to some extent. However, if we want to maximize muscle growth, we would want to manipulate variables in the following ways. Take each set fairly close to failure, at least around 3 reps in reserve. Train with a sufficient amount of volume, at least around 10 sets per muscle group per week. Lift somewhere within the approximate 5 to 20 rep range and adjust load accordingly. And ensure that fatigue of the target muscle is the limiter of each set. The other primary adaptation that resistance training is effective for is strength gains. Similar to hypertrophy, almost any form of resistance training is going to result in some amount of strength gain, at least as a beginner. However, unlike hypertrophy, strength is specific to the requirements of the task. So to maximize strength of any given lift, we would want to lift with the following considerations in mind. Train the lifts you want to get stronger at with heavy loads, within the approximate 1 to 5 rep range. Train the strength lifts to competition standards, for example, squatting to the depth you are required. Perform the strength lifts with the most biomechanically efficient technique. In other words, the technique that allows you to lift the most weight within the competition rules. Perform accessory lifts for the prime movers within the 5 to 20 rep range with the intent to build muscle. And you would probably want to periodize strength training to peak at specific times of the year. And the last adaptation that we can achieve via resistance training is cardiorespiratory endurance. We usually don't associate resistance training as a way to promote cardiorespiratory adaptations, and it is true that it is not the most effective method to train for this goal. However, lifting does seem to be somewhat effective for promoting cardiorespiratory endurance. This study compared cardiorespiratory endurance between bodybuilders and endurance athletes. 22 competitive bodybuilders and 20 endurance-trained subjects underwent 1RM strength testing and endurance testing. As expected, the endurance athletes had a greater VO2 max ability, which is a general indicator of cardiorespiratory endurance. However, the bodybuilders still had a decent level of fitness by most standards at around 50 milliliters per kilogram per minute. This would put the bodybuilders in around an above average to good range based on males of their age by most normative standards. Although it should be noted that we can't say that this level of fitness is purely a result of weight training, as these bodybuilders may also include some cardio or other forms of exercise in their regular training routines. Furthermore, the level of endurance adaptations you get from resistance training is also going to be influenced by the specific programming variables of your lifting routine. Training with shorter rest periods, higher rep ranges, more compound lifts, and higher volumes are generally going to result in greater endurance adaptations compared with longer rest periods, lower rep ranges, isolation lifts, and lower volumes. Moving on from resistance training, the next form of exercise we will cover is general physical activity. This isn't really a well-defined term, but it can generally be described as unintentional exercise or leisurely exercise without the intent to induce any specific adaptations. This might include going for a walk, doing housework, gardening, or movement as part of your occupation. While it doesn't cover all forms of movement, the best way to quantify general physical activity is via your total daily step count as measured by a pedometer or other fitness device. There are 2 outcomes that are generally associated with general physical activity that are relevant for this video. The first is cardiorespiratory endurance. So the question is, how effective is general activity for endurance adaptations? This question was assessed in this study, which analysed the association between step counts and various different fitness measures. 70 men and women between 21 to 49 years old wore a pedometer for 4 days while going about their regular daily activities. Total steps per day were recorded, as well as aerobic steps, which was defined as performing 60 or more steps per minute for more than 1 minute, which is an indicator of higher intensity exercise. At the end of the study, subjects were grouped into 3 categories. Low steps, meaning those who performed less than 5,000 steps per day on average. High steps, meaning 5,000 or more per day. Or high steps plus aerobic steps, meaning performing at least 5,000 steps and accumulating some aerobic steps. It was found that both the low and high step counts groups had similar VO2 max scores, but the high steps plus aerobic steps had a greater VO2 max than the others. So while a high step count might help with cardiorespiratory fitness a little bit, it is really higher intensity exercise that will have more of a benefit. This is something we will discuss soon in the cardio section. So instead of general physical activity having the purpose of promoting cardiorespiratory endurance, the main benefit of general physical activity is for energy expenditure purposes. The total amount of energy we expend throughout the entire day is mostly a result of our metabolic rate and our general physical activity levels. Intentional exercise usually only lasts for a short duration, and therefore usually doesn't contribute all that much to total daily energy expenditure, unless we are talking about intense prolonged exercise such as the training required for many endurance sports. But in most cases, our total daily step count is going to be a better way to assess energy expenditure compared with the time or intensity of specific workouts. However, the relationship between exercise and energy expenditure is a fairly complex interaction, and it isn't entirely understood. This study aimed to assess the influence of physical activity on total daily energy expenditure. The available evidence showed that more exercise generally results in greater total daily energy expenditure, but seems to plateau with high levels of exercise. So based on our current understanding, energy expenditure seems to be somewhat constrained. More exercise does tend to result in more calories burned, but other components likely compensate, so the net result isn't quite as high as what we would expect. And this compensation seems to be more pronounced with higher levels of exercise. In practical terms, if you were performing less than 5,000 steps per day, increasing your activity levels is almost certainly going to have a meaningful effect on energy expenditure. Although once we start going above around 10,000 steps, the additional energy expenditure probably starts to plateau due to energy compensation. And going beyond around 15,000 steps probably results in slightly more energy expenditure, but probably isn't worth the time and effort unless it is a natural occurrence of your occupation or habitual activity. And the last form of exercise to discuss is cardio. There isn't really a true definition of what cardio is, but we can distinguish cardio from general physical activity by intensity. Cardio is generally of higher intensity with the goal of promoting some sort of endurance adaptations. Furthermore, we can also distinguish cardio from resistance training by what is the limiting system. With resistance training, local muscular fatigue is what limits how much we can lift or how many reps we can perform. Whereas for cardio, fatigue of the cardiorespiratory system is the limiter of how fast or how long we can perform cardio for. There are 2 primary roles of cardio. The first is for energy expenditure. Forms of cardio are generally going to expend the most amount of energy while exercising. This research review compared the energy cost of various different exercise tasks. And as we would expect, higher intensity forms of cardio, such as swimming, running, and playing sport, tend to expend the most amount of energy per minute of exercise. However, we usually only perform cardio for a relatively short amount of time as a fraction of the entire day, and even less so as a fraction of the entire week. So even if it does burn more energy while exercising, it doesn't always mean that we are going to burn more energy throughout the course of the entire day. This is because we often see that individuals compensate by performing less movement for the rest of the day. So from an energy expenditure perspective, it is best to look at cardio as one component which contributes to our total daily physical activity levels, since this is going to be a better predictor of energy expenditure via exercise. So the primary role that cardio plays is for endurance performance. Cardio is certainly the most effective form of exercise for developing endurance performance, if that is one of your goals. This could be for recreational purposes, specific endurance events, or for sports which require high cardiorespiratory fitness. The way in which your cardio training is performed will be based on the specific sport or event. You can manipulate the type of cardio modality, the work-to-rest ratios, the total duration, the intensity, and how often you perform cardio based on your specific context. So now that we've discussed the role of exercise in body composition and performance outcomes, let's now discuss diet. Our diet has 3 primary roles relating to the topic of this video. First is that it constitutes one half of the energy balance equation, our calorie intake. As we have discussed, we can increase energy expenditure via exercise to some extent, but it isn't quite as effective as we may think, due to compensation from other components and the constrained nature of energy expenditure. But when it comes to energy intake, we can have a much greater impact on the energy balance equation. Eating more or less calories is a true change in energy intake with no compensation. If our goal is to reduce body fat, we usually need to be in a calorie deficit for any meaningful fat loss to occur, while performing resistance training to preserve muscle mass. This calorie deficit can be achieved to some extent by doing more exercise, but reducing calorie intake is going to be a more effective strategy. And in terms of the rate of weight loss, as a general rule, trainees should aim to reduce body weight at an average of no more than 1% of body weight per week to maximize muscle preservation and stay adherent to the diet during the weight loss process. The second role that diet plays relating to body composition is to assist muscle growth. As we mentioned, resistance training is the stimulus for muscle growth. So while our diet isn't going to trigger muscle growth from scratch, it can assist in the muscle building process. There are 2 primary ways in which we can manipulate our diet to maximize the muscle growth response from training. The first is via energy balance. To maximize muscle growth, we would ideally want to be in a neutral to positive energy balance for an extended duration. Muscle growth can occur in a calorie deficit, but it seems to be less of an anabolic environment compared with maintaining or gaining body weight. This was established in this meta-analysis, which aimed to assess the influence of a calorie deficit on muscle growth. As expected, a calorie deficit was overall less effective for building muscle mass than not being in a deficit, in other words, maintaining or gaining body weight. Furthermore, the magnitude of the deficit also appears to influence muscle mass changes. A deficit of less than around 500 calories per day on average still seems to permit further muscle growth. However, a larger deficit of more than around 500 calories seems to result in muscle losses. And the other primary nutrition variable that can assist muscle growth is our protein intake. Higher total daily protein intakes are generally favorable for muscle growth when performing resistance training. This meta-analysis analyzed the body of evidence on the effects of protein intake on muscle growth. Data from 105 studies were analyzed in various different ways. Most relevant for this video is probably this graph here, which only included data from studies which implemented resistance training during the intervention. It was found that higher protein intakes generally result in superior gains in lean mass, although there appears to be a point of diminishing returns beyond around 1.5 grams per kilogram per day on average, where more protein has less additional benefit for muscle growth. As a practical guide, here is a table which provides individualized minimum protein recommendations based on body weight, sex, body fat, and diet preference. And here is the same table using pounds as opposed to kilograms. And the last role of diet is to fuel lifting performance to some extent. Resistance training isn't all that energetically expensive compared with cardio, but appropriate pre-workout nutrition might help us perform a little better in certain contexts. More specifically, having enough carbohydrate available to perform at our best in the gym might help us provide a slightly superior training stimulus. Although we should keep in mind that nutrition manipulation isn't going to have a major impact on lifting performance, only a small benefit in some contexts. This was established in this systematic review, which compared the effects of different carbohydrate feeding strategies on resistance training performance. Overall, it was found that eating more carbohydrates around a workout didn't seem to influence lifting performance in most studies. And the ones which found benefits of increasing carbohydrate intake before a workout were in those which used participants who had been fasting and those who performed higher volume workouts. Here are some practical guidelines to ensure you are fueling your workouts appropriately. If you are not in a calorie deficit, you are not in a fasted state, your workout is fairly low in volume, and you haven't performed any intense exercise before your workout, then carbohydrate manipulation likely isn't going to have any effect on your workout performance. However, if you are in a severe calorie deficit, you haven't eaten for many hours, your workout is higher in volume, and you are performing multiple exercise sessions per day, then it is recommended to consume a decent serving of carbohydrates within a couple of hours before your session. Taking all this information, let's establish some practical recommendations. In terms of exercise, we have 3 categories. The first is resistance training. This has the role of stimulating muscle growth and providing strength adaptations. Without this stimulus, there is no trigger for the body to build muscle or get stronger, regardless of nutrition. Resistance training can also provide a decent cardiorespiratory stimulus in some cases, but not to the same extent as dedicated cardio. Next is general physical activity. This is the best way to assess our total daily energy expenditure from movement, usually quantified as the total number of steps performed per day. This is because it takes into account movement throughout the entire day, not just individual exercise bouts. Although general physical activity is not great for improving cardiorespiratory endurance unless the intensity of it is relatively high. Although high-intensity general physical activity might be classified in the same category as cardio. Cardio is best for developing cardiorespiratory endurance, which might be an adaptation you're after for sport or endurance performance goals. However, individual cardio sessions are not all that predictive of your total daily energy expenditure, as they only account for a small fraction of time relative to the entire day and entire week. In terms of diet, this has 3 primary roles for body composition changes. First is to manipulate energy balance. Exercise can influence energy expenditure, although manipulating diet is usually going to be more effective. This makes it an easier and more predictable way to induce a calorie deficit or surplus, depending on our current goal. Diet can also assist the muscle growth process to some extent. No dietary factors are going to stimulate muscle growth, but they can amplify our hypertrophy adaptations from resistance training. Muscle growth is going to be maximized when eating at maintenance calories or a surplus, while a deficit will be slightly less anabolic. Also, consuming a higher total daily protein intake will usually result in superior muscle growth during any energy balance state. And lastly, diet can help ensure lifting performance is maximized, which might help to provide a slightly superior hypertrophy stimulus. To appropriately fuel lifting performance, ensure that you have eaten a reasonable amount of carbohydrates within a few hours prior to your workouts. And this becomes more of an important factor if you are currently in a severe calorie deficit, if you are currently in a fasted state, if the training session is higher in volume, or if you are performing multiple exercise sessions per day. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.